Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you to the board of the World Affairs Council for having me here today, and also to the team. I just want to give a shout out to Shannon, Madison, and Charlotte. I know what it takes to run something like this in the background, and you guys are hustling, and I really appreciate it. And also to LJ, of course, for the gracious invitation to join you today. I thought I would start just kind of give you a little Tracy and ask a question. How many of you guys remember where you were on September 11th, 2001? Okay. How many remember where you were on June 23rd, 2023? Yeah, random date. But that was the day that a man named Yevgeny Prigozhin called for his army of mercenaries. We don't really know the number still to this day, but thousands of them, to march on Moscow in what was termed a coup, but really was just a rebellion, a mutiny, a desire to challenge the way the war was going in Ukraine. Most of you will remember that day. You might not remember the date, but you certainly will remember the moment when it looked just like for a second that Vladimir Putin's regime might be toppled. And that was the first time in 30 years that his regime had seen that kind of challenge to his political hold on power. He really has an iron grip. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that moment, what led up to it, and also talk to you a little bit about where we are today in this situation with relations between the United States and Russia, Europe, NATO, and Ukraine. And if you're at all like me, I am sure that you are feeling a sense of whiplash, especially about US-Russia relations. If you've been reading the headlines, just to contextualize a little bit, we have seen, gosh, in the last, I guess, 8-9 months, just a tremendous amount of activity and static and friction. All of you will probably remember the day on which Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, was in the White House with Donald Trump, our president, and there was that very dramatic encounter between the two of them that seemed to suggest that maybe something was changing about the way the United States was oriented to the world, as well as its obligations to NATO, and of course its alliance with Ukraine. And then we saw, the White House roll out the red carpet in Alaska in a bid to try and bring Vladimir Putin to the table for negotiations. A bid that so far, rather predictably, has failed for a number of reasons. And very shortly thereafter, we saw a huge change in attitudes all around. Europe is starting to think about tapping into Russia's reserves to pay for defense in Ukraine. That's a huge shift. We have some German friends here today. There was a huge change in Germany's constitution to allow for more defense spending, to support the expansion of European military power to confront or at least defend against a possible threat from Russia. And just this last week, we have seen also the United States kind of make another pivot. We've seen the White House sort of shift a little bit in its position and impose sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which are two of the largest oil companies in Russia. They are really the backbone of Russia's economy. And we saw another response, of course, from Putin just this week. 2 missiles that are part of this nuclear arsenal of Russia's were tested this week. And Putin was very happy to talk about that quite openly. And only yesterday, we saw a response from President Trump while he was meeting with Xi Jinping in China, in South Korea, saying that the United States would now move forward with lifting its pause on testing nuclear weapons. This is, a profound change. That hasn't happened in over 30 years. Part of how we got here is really the story of Yevgeny Prigozhin and his relationship with Vladimir Putin. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. The story I want to tell is beyond these headlines on a lot of levels. And it's really kind of driven by forces that I have also been kind of grappling with since I was a kid. Just for background, some of you heard this last night at dinner. I'm from Chicago originally, grew up there. My mom was an English teacher, took Russian in high school, and I also took it in college. And I was an exchange student in St. Petersburg in 1995, 96. And that happened to be this very same year that Yevgeny Prigozhin was opening his first big restaurant. It was a restaurant called the Old Customs House, big luxury restaurant. And it was also the same year that Vladimir Putin was getting ready to make a move to Moscow. He was deputy mayor at that time. And I gotta tell you, I didn't know anything about this, okay? I was just a kid who was stumbling around, partying, drinking vodka, trying to like make it through my Russian lessons. I didn't really pay attention. But the one thing that stands out is something that I remember at nighttime in St. Petersburg. If you wanted to get something to eat, it was kind of hard to do. There weren't like McDonald's everywhere, but there were these kiosks that offered hot dogs. And if anybody knows or has read the book, you'll know that Yevgeny Prigozhin started his career, at least in business, in part by selling hot dogs at these kiosks, basically. So I guess I have a little bit of claim to fame, so much as I probably ate Prigozhin's hot dog. So the story of Prigozhin's life and his rise to power very much parallels the story of Putin's life. These are two guys who grew up, born and raised in St. Petersburg, at a time when the whole world was shifting, but the Soviet Union was really in free fall. One, Vladimir Putin, was the grandson of Stalin's personal chef. And he was also a KGB agent who was just finishing up his tour in East Germany, 1989, when the wall fell, very famously. And he was recalled to St. Petersburg, came back in about 1990, and tried to start a new life as a politico, basically. Found his way on the coattails of the mayor and became his right-hand man. At the same time, Yevgeny Prigozhin in 1990 was just exiting prison. And his background was, he was a young man who was a champion skier. He'd gone to an Olympic academy in St. Petersburg, and he was left lame by an accident that happened sometime in his teen years that put him on a trajectory of a life of crime. And then ultimately sent him to prison for almost 10 years. And so when he got out in 1990, he started this hot dog stand, and lo and behold, their paths kind of started to converge. And it was at this time, I was in the city, and as I said, I didn't really know what was going on, but some things I did notice. The city was broken. It was in a state of transformation, just like the rest of the country. Food was in short supply, and people were really struggling. Beautiful buildings on the outside, wedding cake palaces, but when you went inside, that decay, that rot had set in the final years of the Soviet Union were really visible. And the ruble, which of course is the currency of Russia, was absolutely worthless, and the dollar was king. And the one thing that Putin and Prigozhin had in common is they had access to dollars. Prigozhin had access to dollars because his kiosk business grew into the restaurants, the whole string of them, and catering, and construction, and casinos, and groceries. And in the meantime, the person who was signing the licenses for all of his business, well that was Vladimir Putin. Because he, as deputy mayor, was in charge of business licensing. And he was extremely influential. And their paths kind of converged there. Their path to power, though, really comes from, I think, four really important factors that I want to kind of highlight for you. One of them is the fact that the world was changing. The Cold War precipitated a major reorganization of militaries around the world. no more wars to fight between Russia and the United States, well, we shrink them, right? And that's largely what we've been seeing, right, is kind of the outfall of that, particularly in Europe, where there was a reduction of military forces. But it also led to a major reorganization inside Russia's security services. And we saw this merger between Russia's security services, then the KGB, today now known as the FSB, and the GRU, which is the military intelligence wing, and a few others, start to merge its interests with the mafia and kind of corner the market on the process of privatization of everything in the country, including, importantly, the security sector. And by lucky chance, they had a huge pool of veterans from the Afghan War who were displaced by that reorganization. These are guys who were out of work and out of sorts, and they needed to find their way. And the mafia and the security services kind of gave them their opening. They were bouncers at bars, right? They manned the security perimeters of big piers and ports and businesses. And there was that first melding. The second piece that was really critical to the rise of Prigozhin and Putin was this sort of reintegration of Russia into a fast globalizing economy, largely because of its role in the oil and energy sector. There was a lot of boom and bust, but that integration led to a lot more money flowing Russia's way. And also empowered state enterprises, particularly in the energy sector and the arms sector. That was super key. Another piece, another factor that was really critical was also the fact that there was really no sort of political center anymore. Everything had kind of fallen apart and there was a need to rebuild institutions. Some of that was done just kind of pro forma. But a lot of it came from the rise of, far right-wing ultranationalists who were deeply religious, very kind of intent on seeing the rise of Christian orthodoxy in a revival, and they started to hold a lot of sway in the country over time, basically. So those things, those factors were really key in kind of lifting the boats and the political propositions of Prigozhin and Putin. In 2000, Vladimir Putin, of course, became president. I think to many people's surprise, he was kind of this dark horse and nobody knew. But when he did come to power, he really started to transform the state. While all that money is rushing in, this new class of oligarchs, they called them the New Russians, and they used to wear these sort of big baggy zoot suits, with big red colors, very bright, it was this kind of fusion of Putin's power and the oligarchy that led to even more transformation in the country and lofted Prigozhin's position because, in fact, now, money was flowing and there was a little bit more food and people were starting to come to Russia, back to Russia to do business. Some people might remember Procter & Gamble, a huge company and office in St. Petersburg. I remember that quite well. A lot of businesses flooded into what was called the windows on the West, right? What that meant for Prigozhin was that he became the caterer extraordinaire, not just to the city, but to the entire country, to the Kremlin. He, feted kings and queens and presidents. Very famously, when George and Laura Bush made their first visit there in St. Petersburg, this is like 2003, they ate lunch on his floating restaurant and floated down the Neva. He's somebody that became kind of an essential player. And while all that was happening, things were changing, of course, on the other side of Russia's border, right? We saw the expansion of NATO, and the inclusion of many more European countries. That was a huge factor precipitating some of the other things that led to the rise of the Wagner Group. We also saw over time the color revolutions. Many of you will remember those. 2003, Georgia. This was a fight to really reclaim Georgia's freedom, but also potentially join the EU, join NATO. and then of course Ukraine in 2004, the Orange Revolution. And this terrified Putin because right across the border, he saw this burgeoning democratic movement, something that was really challenging his hold and Russia's hold on these border regions, and threatening a lot of different things, but importantly, the energy and arms industry, right, which was largely unified across the Soviet Union still, even though the Soviet Union had broken up. Even today, you can find Russian weapons, of course, in Georgia and Ukraine. All the former Soviet states still have the same kit, basically. And to lose that market was to lose all the things that had made Russia rich over those roughly 10 years during Putin's rise to power. And also, it threatened energy networks, importantly. If you've ever been to any part of the Caucasus, you will know it's very mountainous, but it is also very rich in gas and oil, particularly around the Caspian region. I went there ages ago, just after the Orange Revolution, and to follow a pipeline called the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which is stretching all the way from the Caspian down to Turkey and then into the Mediterranean, in theory. And that pipeline was actually BP, as well as a couple of other organizations, but importantly the United States, put a lot of political weight behind the building of that pipeline, and that was another tension in the region. And Ukraine, of course, has a lot of oil and gas infrastructure as well, and so to lose that, right, was to lose the backbone of the Russian economy. It wasn't just about sort of fear of a democratic uprising. It was a fear that the crumbling of the Russian economy would ultimately also lead to the crumbling of the regime. And Putin built, over time, a response to this. Part of the response was unleashing private citizens, people like Yevgeny Prigozhin, as kind of influencers, particularly with the use of information technology. This is another important factor in the rise of Yevgeny Prigozhin and the merger of these two kind of men and their interests. The desire to control information, to influence what was on Facebook-like platforms. One is called VKontakte. Another is called Telegram. Some of you may have heard of it. The desire to influence opposition and tamp it down domestically, as well as a response to these democratic uprisings just across the border in Eastern Europe, led to this kind of important rise of Prigozhin, who had mastered social media as a marketing tool, primarily for his own businesses. Very famously, I'll just tell this weird little story. At one point, his catering business wasn't going so well. There were a few restaurants that had folded, and he was quite desperate. And there was a rival caterer in St. Petersburg who was trying to muscle in on the market. And so he hired somebody to kind of gin up this scenario where they would get a couple people to attend one of these catered events of the rival. They went to a restaurant. It's kind of an event like this, like the little sort of meeting hall scenario. And then they filmed these plants eating the food and then faking vomiting and doing it on camera. It was really, sorry, it's very graphic. But that became this viral campaign to decimate his adversary, and it worked, right? It worked. Fast forward to 2011, 2012, these marches, this uprising against Putin when he returned, said he was going to be president again. We saw these marches in the street. And here again, Putin, he saw the echo of something, right? He saw these color revolutions now happening inside of Russia. And he was convinced that this was the hand of Washington, right? That there was a shadow hand that was all behind the uprising of hundreds of thousands of people. Very famously, he of course called out Hillary Clinton as the villain behind this, this conspiracy. And the person who was there to help him tamp down all of that opposition, Yevgeny Prigozhin. His marketing skills started to transform into what some of you may have heard of, which is a troll farm army. A virtual army of several dozen kids, basically, from St. Petersburg State University, who are very good at speaking languages. I went there. It's kind of the king, I guess, or the Harvard, if you will, of language learning, right? So French, Spanish, English. It's the place you go, basically. So Prigozhin, he understands this, and he hires all these 20-something hipsters to get on Facebook, right, get on Twitter, and start decimating Putin's rivals, including Alexei Navalny. How many of you guys know Alexei Navalny? Right. This is actually the beginning of Alexei Navalny's political career as an opposition politician, and he is clashing openly with Prigozhin. But Prigozhin is very successful. He manages somehow to kind of corral these trolls, and again, with some help from friends in the Kremlin, the opposition starts to fritter away. But in the meantime, the other threat was the Arab Spring. This is 2010, right? We're already seeing this arc of really disruption in politics all across the Middle East. And those places were not just countries in the Middle East. These were places where Russia for years, decades, had sold weapons, right? To Libya, to Syria, to even Egypt. All of these places were huge clients of the Russian military security enterprise. And they were also beneficiaries of a lot of the extractive talents of Gazprom, right? Rosneft, other big oil companies. So when that happened, it was kind of another, earthquake that really, again, spooked Putin. And it just so happened that some of his military generals, came up with a cute little idea, tried to test it out. What they wanted to do was do something like Blackwater. You guys know Blackwater. Everybody knows Blackwater, right? This is the American private military company that very famously, jumped out in Iraq, and then, of course, imploded over time. But nonetheless, some of these Russian generals were really intrigued by the idea of standing up a private military force that could go out there and do things that the conventional military couldn't without drawing some sort of blowback from NATO, right? So here's where the game really begins. This is the rise of what became a very important deception operation, one of the biggest and most successful in the history of Russia, and possibly the world, I would say. Think about this. Syria is collapsing. The Assad regime, 2013, has no way forward. ISIS is on the rise, and all of it is happening exactly in the place where Gazprom and some other major Russian companies have their biggest investments. How do they secure those investments? Well, they hire a group of mercenaries to go out there, deliver weapons, and try and secure this area. Now, it went over a different name at that time, but by the time we get to 2014, right, and we see this kind of brewing new democratic uprising in Ukraine with the Maidan revolution, now these guys are starting to look real attractive and real useful, largely because, again, any response from Russia inside Europe, right, or inside territories where NATO and the United States have pretty strong military and economic interests, is spoiling for a fight that you can't win, right? Especially for direct confrontation. And so when in late 2014, this uprising in Kiev really started to boil over, a decision was made in the Kremlin, kind of by clutch really, to try a new experiment, to see if maybe there wasn't a way, an end run around the challenge of this asymmetry of power between the United States and NATO and Russia over this big football called Eastern Europe and part of the Middle East as well. And so who remembers the Little Green Men? These were the guys who rocked up, right, in Crimea. Suddenly, these green uniforms looked a lot like the Russian military, but no insignia, right, wearing masks. And they marched into the peninsula and took it over in response to what they perceived as a potential putsch that was happening in Kyiv that threatened their military basing in Crimea, which is the opening to the Black Sea. Critical for what? Critical for being a warm water port, and the only one that Russia can deploy not only troops from, but also gas tankers, oil tankers, and then tankers that deliver weapons, right? So losing the Black Sea was a big no-no. That was not going to happen. But again, couldn't have the confrontation. So the solve was experimenting with the little green men and seeing if you couldn't also march them into the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, because there was a lot of infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, critically energy infrastructure. And we all now know, because of the deal just made with the White House and Kyiv, there's also a lot of critical minerals there, right? And Russia has known this for a long time, so they didn't want to lose it. And they sent these proxy forces into the Donbass. And at that time, nobody had ever heard of Wagner Group. Not that many people really, especially outside of Russia, knew who Yevgeny Prigozhin was. I don't even know if I knew who he was, that's for sure. And I do pay attention to things in Russia. But what I do remember is that there were a lot of these guys, again, no uniforms, kind of strange. And when I first went to Ukraine, this is after 3 or 4 years into the war, and I went down to one of the towns in the front line, a town called Dnipro. I remember talking to some of the militia who had fought during this time, 2014, and their wives, who had also survived some of this. And they said, we saw them coming, but they came a year before. So as early as 2013, they came in 1s and 2s and 3s, no uniforms, renting apartments, finding strategic locations. This was a planned operation with a lot of forethought. There was no Wagner Group then, but there was something called Battalion Group V. And I learned this from looking at some leaked documents that were shared with me just as I was getting ready to kind of close off this chapter of writing this book. And it was just a stunning account of the rise of this experimental battalion that was first 10 guys, then 300, and then grew to 3,000 by the time it got to Syria in 2015 and began really serious operations there. And then there was 2016, this expansion into Africa. We saw them in Central African Republic. We saw them in Sudan, right? And then eventually we saw them in Libya. But the moment that the world really started paying attention, despite the fact that this is a pretty exciting story, right? I mean, a lot of action happening here, was really in 2018. And I was talking to friends last night at the dinner about this moment in February 2018, when there was this epic clash in the desert of Syria, northeast Syria, near a gas plant in Conoco. It was a Conoco plant that had sort of fallen into the hands of ISIS and had become this object of contestation during the war. Of course, you had U.S. Special Forces there trying to tamp down ISIS in the Iraq-Syria region. On one side of the Euphrates River, where this plant is kind of located, you have Special Forces from the United States and their allies from Syria and Iraq. And then on the other side, you have Russian forces who were trying to kind of pinch her and trying to control that area. And on that day, February 7th, 2018, they decided to go for it. And they decided to cross the Euphrates and see if they couldn't take on the United States Special Forces. It didn't go well. And it was the first contact between Russian and American forces since Vietnam. It was the first time that you had a situation in which two nuclear powers, two superpowers, really facing off on the battlefield. And it was a point at which the danger of escalation rang a bell in Washington. And it's actually at that point that I actually, just by happenstance, happened to be studying the concept of proxy warfare for a project I was working on. And I started to kind of look into it. And then, I'm kind of, at that stage, I'm old enough that I don't really want to go back to a war zone full time. And it's also Syria. I had spent, 5 years in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And, I didn't have the needs for it anymore. But I could go to Ukraine, I could do those kind of things. But I did get introduced to an interesting method of journalism that has now kind of swept up in the last years. It's called open source investigation. And if any of you have heard of an organization called Bellingcat, you'll recognize their name because, of course, they were just a little collective of guys, mostly video game nerds and internet freaks, who put together the clues to the downing of the MH17 Malaysia jet airliner back in 2014. A lot of people admired their work. I went and took a few classes with them, and it kind of blew my mind. And I realized that actually if I wanted to get to the battlefield, well, I could just do what they were doing, and I could just troll, Telegram and contact you. And I learned something. Right around 2018, right around when that incident happened, there was this video that had gone viral first in June of 2017. Came across it. It's just a little 2-minute clip, and man, every time I say that word, the image comes back to me. It was a 2-minute clip of 4 or 5 guys, masked faces, and desert camo, mobile phone, real shaky. Some weird, landscape kind of industrial, and this loud Russian rock music in the background. And suddenly, a couple of them swing into the view, and there's a guy on the ground. He's, screaming, and they're beating him with a sledgehammer. And he's alive. And there are a couple of, most of you are done with your lunch. There are a couple of severed heads on the ground next to him. It was a really horrifying scene. That wasn't the only clip. Very shortly after that, first one went viral and just provoked a huge amount of sort of public interest in what was happening. People realized, okay, this is probably Wagner, but they didn't know where it was. They didn't know the victim's name. They didn't know who those guys were. And then a few months later, a couple more clips were released. And it showed this man, his name is Hamdi Buta, being dismembered, beheaded, and then his body set on fire. And all the while, these guys with the sledgehammer, laughing, joking. It was a tremendous scene. And it really sticks with me. And it stuck with a lot of people, including, frankly, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who saw in that moment not brutality, not a war crime, but a marketing opportunity. And very quickly, after that, those videos went viral, we started to see online coffee mugs with, a big old meme with a guy with a sledgehammer swinging it like an axe at a devil, horned devil on the ground. That meme of that sledgehammer was on T-shirts, it was on uniform patches. People started to change their profiles online to match these guys who committed this tremendously horrible war crime. And that's when I realized this is a brand. This is not a band of brothers. This is something bigger. This is political technology meets organized crime meets paramilitary force, all backed by GRU, Russian military intelligence services in the Kremlin. And yet, at the same time, the news story was mysterious guys run private military company. Nobody knows who controls them. But it was pretty obvious once you started to look at what they were trying to control. The gas plants, the oil pipelines, the mines in places like Central African Republic, stuffed with gold, diamonds, timber. That's when you started to realize, this is something else. This is, number one, a sanctions evasion mechanism. All of these countries, Syria, Central African Republic, Libya, had labored under sanctions for years because of their own sort of dictatorships, authoritarian abuse of power. And they were desperate, and they were very unstable, and they needed military muscle, and Russia had it to offer, but it couldn't do so directly. It was Wagner and Prigozhin who was acting as the cutout, as the proxy. So that sanctions evasion piece is one of the number one motivations, right? Russia could do business with sanctioned actors as long as it had this deception that they were doing this under guise of sort of private sector activity. The second piece was this made the gray zone very profitable and popular, right? People could get into it. You can, with logistics networks, you need to fly commercial, you need to ship things. This is a big money-making enterprise, including money laundering, right? Digital currency. This is an illicit empire extraordinaire. And it becomes key to a strategy of stockpiling and making sure you got enough dollars and euros and hard currencies in your treasury just in case you want to go back to war again. Number three, this kind of fusion of interest between Russia and its client states in places like Africa was also an effort to build an anti-NATO bloc. I was telling folks last night that France's President Emmanuel Macron a couple of years ago called the Wagner Group an insurance policy for authoritarian dictators. And that's right. And those dictators are very grateful to Russia for stabilizing their governments and making sure that they can stay in power. And in exchange, when you go to the UN and you come to a vote, for instance, about North Korea or Libya and ending sanctions on them, those countries will line up right behind Russia. So those three things, that sanctions, evasions, that gray zone profitability, right, and then building an anti-NATO bloc is really the main strategic purpose of the Wagner Group as an idea, as a brand, right, building this image of being able to project power everywhere. But let's not forget one more thing. You all will remember the US elections in 2016 and the controversies there with Facebook and Twitter and social media. Yevgeny Prigozhin again, right? So disinformation is key. Destabilizing adversaries, blinding them, throwing them off balance. This is the concept of maskirovka, which is, in irregular warfare terms, it just means camouflage. Hiding the real, showing the false. What does all this mean for today? What it means is there's a great deal of dependence Russia has on this business model for its survival. We see now that the war in Ukraine is about to reach its fourth year. That's largely because the Wagner Group, up until that big mutiny that happened, and then of course Yevgeny Prigozhin's death just a couple months later in August 2023, was important for financing the war. Critical. All of that money circulating from gold and oil and diamond trade was circulating through the coffers of the Russian economy, and it still does to this day, just in a new form. Many of you may have heard that after the Wagner Group fell apart, it was basically absorbed into something called the Africa Corps, which is now an official sort of paramilitary force, and that officially operates on the leash with the GRU's permission, right, in places like Mali. And if you've been paying attention to the news lately, you'll know that Mali's not in great shape. It turns out that running a full-time conventional total war in one theater and then trying to run a paramilitary, gray zone, force in another is not so easy to do. But it continues. It continues unchecked for a lot of different reasons. This model of parastatal force, gray zone warfare, is just one piece of the kinetics, but there's another piece that I've been following much more recently, and it's actually the transformation of the Wagner Group brand into a mechanism for recruiting young men across Europe to sabotage European infrastructure. I was just at a court case in London involving the charges against 6 young men, all in their 20s, Britons, who were charged with setting on fire a warehouse in East London because they had fallen into this deep rabbit hole of Wagner Group Telegram channels. And one of them, the ringleader, his name is Dylan Earl, became convinced that he was going to be the next leader of kind of this transnational IRA. And he was convinced by something called Privyet-bot, which means hello bot, by an anonymous handler at the other end of some Telegram channel somewhere in St. Petersburg or Moscow. These 6 men lit the warehouse on fire, filled with Starlink terminals bound for Ukraine. And they were supposed to also kidnap and execute a Russian dissident who had made good in Mayfair and had a couple of restaurants. So all of this is to say, the Wagner Group as a force, a paramilitary force, might be dead in some people's minds, but the concept and the business model lives on. And while it does, this will make it possible for Putin to keep drawing on these reserves to fight forward. So I'm going to close here and just say, what does that mean for us, for the United States, for its allies in Europe, and for others? It means that we've got to get a lot more serious about these gray zone threats. We have to treat them as a systemic threat, not just a sideshow. We have to be really serious about also enabling our partners in Europe to fight this fight. And that means on the military front and the economic front. Yes, of course, Europe really needs to take the lead, but they're not quite ready yet. And so we got to stick by these folks just a little bit longer until they're ready to go. It also means that with Ukraine, if we really want to see this war end and stop the bleeding and the violence, we're going to have to enable them. We're going to have to probably give them deep strike capacity, where there's been talk about tomahawks. That probably should happen with restraints. And the last but not least, we all need to be thinking about how this model might be replicated in other places. And here I'm thinking specifically of Taiwan and China. And the work that we have to do here in the United States and in Washington is to keep investing in unique and innovative types of intelligence and diplomacy, and investing in the future of young people who were like me years ago, studying languages like Russian and Chinese, hard languages that are important for us understanding our adversaries. And I am really pleased to say, somebody asked me what gives me hope last night, and I said, well, this. You all are invested in this, in the education of the future generations, but also in the exchange of information on global studies and global power. And with that, I thank you for your energy and your service and for listening.
Thank you, Candace. I'm shorter than Candace. My name is David Jones. I'm on the board of the World Affairs Council as well, and just pleasure to have you here. I can see why your background is in investigative reporting. That story was amazing, all the background. We now have time for Q&A, and I'll be calling on folks to ask questions. I think one thing that happens sometimes is people are not really asking a question, but instead making a statement. If you please actually ask a question, that would be great. And also, I think sometimes people would prefer to get into questions, and I know that's what you would like, but there are a lot of people here, and everybody probably has questions. So if you could please keep it to one question, that'd be great. So I'll open it up to the group. I saw in the back table there first.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, there's a microphone coming.
Hello, testing. Thank you so much. That was riveting and disturbing at the same time. So my question is, how does what you're talking about align with anything the administration is doing?
Really good question. I have a lot of conversations with folks inside and outside the administration. More lately, I have to say it is outside. And I think one of the things that's really shifted just for atmospherics is because of the cuts to the State Department, parts of our diplomatic arm. It just means that it's hard to kind of know, and it seems like there is a little bit of uncertainty, right? I think there's a divide. But I did recently get a briefing from somebody inside the administration, pretty high up there, who's been dealing with these affairs. And my impression is they're really, this is now a month and a half ago, so things probably have changed a little bit because of what's just happened with these nuclear tests. But at the time, this gentleman said, we think that it might be possible to bring Russia on side so that we can counter China. So a lot of what you're seeing in what maybe looks like very inconsistent posturing from the Trump administration is a sense that maybe because of that relationship, that warm relationship that Trump often talks about with Putin, he could kind of convince Putin to maybe just stick with a couple of concessions, right, and move on from this war in Ukraine, and the business doors are open. So that's the primary, I think that's the umbrella that they've been working under. It is the predominant argument that's winning the day. I do think that the minute that you start talking about restarting nuclear tests of our arsenal, it means that something has changed. Whoever is on the other side of that argument, and I would argue, frankly, they call this the reverse Kissinger, right? Which is like, you know, bringing Russia on side to counter China. I would argue that that's not a really smart strategy. But I don't know if the other part is either, right? Escalation at this level without doing the hard work of figuring out how our European partners who need to be at the table, 100%, it's their doorstep, right? Without giving them a little bit more room at the table and not treating them as sort of a junior partner, it's gonna be really hard. So I don't see a lot of nuanced thinking or even foresight, unfortunately. And they're not the first administration I can say that about. That's true of Biden. I would say that's true of Obama. You know, the reality is it's a difficult and sticky problem. And we've always been, for some strange reason, under the impression that Russia is this sort of regional power that doesn't really have a lot of sway. Well, we're wrong, right? So I guess to answer your question, it's a little hard to tell who's winning the argument, but increasingly we're moving toward a period of escalation that I think could be very dangerous.
We could take one of the students back here. We have some high school students with us, and I think I'll speak as well.
Thank you. I really enjoyed what you were talking about. You said you spent some time in Pakistan, and I spoke to an editor at the Harvard National Security Journal. He told me, this is very dramatic, but he told me that the only thing that keeps him up at night is the fact that Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Do you agree with the statement, and could you maybe elaborate on some instability inside Pakistan and your insights that you can argue? Thank you.
Great question. You warned me. They said that there were going to be smart questions out here. So I haven't been in Pakistan in many years, but I do pay attention. And we actually just recently at New America hosted the ambassador to Pakistan at our annual forum that we have. And he talked at length about what just happened between Pakistan and India and this rather very dangerous exchange between these two nuclear powers. I do remember in 2008, when I first went there, that a similar thing happened after the Mumbai attacks. Right, there was this kind of very dangerous exchange. So I can imagine, just how tense it must have been inside Pakistan, because it is a very powerful, nuclear adversary of India, and it really faces a lot of, as you know, probably a lot of instability internally. I'm not just worried about Pakistan. Okay, I think we should all be worried about any country that has that level of internal conflict that it cannot seem to control. Here, I would say Iran. That's one reason why, whether we agree or disagree with actions taken, there's good reason to fear the idea of Iran having nuclear weapons, because it's not so obvious that that regime would actually survive in a new scenario, right? Anytime we have somebody with their hand on the button and not a lot of process, is a dangerous time for the world. So I think proliferation is challenging. And I think, unfortunately for Pakistan, they're dealing with so many things on so many fronts, including climate change. And that will continue to challenge the state because of this kind of refusal, if I may, to really integrate some of the Afghans that are there, some of the migrants that are there, to deal with the problems in Baluchistan that are still kind of bubbling. All of those issues, as long as they bubble, they make it a very dangerous place for Pakistan to have nuclear weapons.
Okay, maybe we could go next slide here.
Thanks for being here today. So we know it's a sticky situation now, and we've been watching it be increasingly sticky for 15 years now. But thinking ahead, how do we prepare for the eventuality? Putin's not going to live forever. What happens when he's gone? Whether it's the United States getting back to some semblance of sensible foreign policy, or our European partners, who, like you said, this is their doorstep. Germany's ramping up military production, and when I started grad school in 2005, that was unthinkable. How do we as a world prepare for what comes next so that we don't end up with this power vacuum again, which following the collapse of the Soviet Union let all these oligarchs and paramilitary groups rush in and fester and develop into what we have today, because this is a fundamental threat to the world in general and not just the Western order. And how do we not repeat the mistakes of the past?
Oh boy. Okay.
Sorry.
She needs another 45.
In 7 seconds or less. Okay, well, I guess, when I was writing the book, one of the things I kind of got really deep into, and I remember this very well, maybe folks have heard of Jeffrey Sachs? Maybe you know him? Harvard economist, who now, he has an interesting career turn. But at the time in the 1990s when I was there as an exchange student, he was a very influential thinker. He was one of the people that advocated for shock therapy for all of the Soviet Union. Just basically rip off the Band-Aid as fast as possible, get them into privatized, sort of a privatized economy. And it sounded like a good idea on paper, but one of the biggest mistakes and a lesson that we need to learn is that not everything can be solved by the market. Sometimes governments do need to be kind of mitigators of challenges in competition between actors, whether it's security actors or whether it's private sector actors. It's just markets are not the entire solve. So the number one thing we have to do is make sure that if we do have a situation where Putin, exits the stage by whatever means, right? And I think that will come, of course. We should count on the fact that there will be turmoil because there is really no succession plan. There are a few people that stand out, and I've mentioned them toward the end of the book, who might be, the next Putin. But there's no guarantee, and I think we'll see a lot of kind of friction and instability, much like we saw in the 1990s. We need to be ready for that and not fearful of challenging the idea that markets can solve everything. Because that fear was what led us to make a lot of maybe unfortunate decisions. We didn't help the Russians when they really needed it. They really needed reconstruction aid, frankly. They really needed a different kind of approach to civic, engagement. And they needed more investment in institutions like journalism. So that's number one. Number two, for our European partners, we have to just do better at keeping that door open to conversation, as I said, not treating them as a junior partner. And they have to do better. I was just in Germany at ramping up and scaling up their military industrial capacity. They're trying, but they got a lot of learning to do. And to the extent that we can, because we are really very well endowed with a lot of technological prowess, to the extent that we can help them, we should be helping them. Not just selling them weapons, but giving them the capacity to do the things that we're now doing that we'd like to see them do. So intelligence and surveillance, right? Long-range strikes, all the things that we do that they can't right now. That's really important. And last, we need to be careful about how we're framing the Russia-China factor. We need to be very cognizant of the fact that there is a deeper fusion of interest between them as long as this war goes on. And we need to understand that pulling Russia away from China is almost going to be impossible just because of the economic and defense integration between them, and this increasing reliance and sort of alliance between what people in the UK call CRINC, right? China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. That is a bloc that is having a lot of influence, and we need to kind of think through how to respond to that, how to contain it.
And then we have another student back here.
This one here?
Yeah. In the gold. Sure. And then I'll get you next.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your insights. Given the influence of groups like the Wagner Group.
Speak into it.
Hello. All right, there we go. Given the growing influence of groups like the Wagner Group operating outside traditional military structures, how can international law adapt to hold these private military actors accountable for potential war crimes or human rights violations?
You asked the question that I always want to talk about. So first of all, for the young folks in the room who can type fast, I want you to go to uncoveringwagner.org. And if you take a look at that, you're going to see that my colleagues and I at New America and Arizona State University has been spending a lot of time trying to document how this organization, this ghost army, worked. And the reason we did that is because if you want to charge somebody with war crimes, you got to know who was in charge, right? And because most of the world believes that Prigozhin was in charge, nobody seems to be really pursuing these cases, right? They feel like he's dead now, we don't have to bother with that. But in actual fact, there is a real hunger, particularly in parts of, obviously, Ukraine, and obviously in Europe. There's a case in Finland that I also covered, in addition to this one in London, of a young man who was part of a Wagner affiliate called Rusic, a very extremist, far-right fascist organization. And he was charged with war crimes from the 2014-2015 era. First one to be charged on extraterritorial war crimes charges in Europe. Largely because of the work that I think our organization has done. There are many others. I've just name checked here, Bellingcat, another organization called All Eyes on Wagner. We have spent years trying to document these war crimes and show how these decisions were made and who paid for it. So the answer to your question, very straight, is to keep enabling the capacity to pursue accountability in theaters like Europe and Ukraine, but also in Africa. We know that there have been a lot of war crimes there, and a couple of colleagues of mine did some work to look at how the Wagner Group used social media in Africa. There's a little Telegram channel called White Uncles in Africa, where you can witness all kinds of manner of atrocities and beheadings and so forth. And my friends put together what's called an Article 15 dossier on this crime of really degrading humans online, basically, with the ICC, the International Criminal Court. These types of actions are really critical. That's number one, accountability. But then also just, as I said, investing in the ability to monitor the shell companies that make all of this happen. And here, I think there's somebody here from Treasury. You spent some time in Treasury. Treasury has done wonderful work on just keeping track of, who's doing what when. They're a little slow, but I think if we keep investing in that, it's going to be important too.
All right, one last question to the gentleman in gray right there, and I'm sorry if I missed you. Hopefully afterwards you can ask your questions directly.
Hello, my name is Luca. I'm from Tbilisi in Georgia and from Kharkiv in Ukraine. So thank you very much for the work you do. This summer I was in Senegal researching Wagner in West Africa and their activities there. I was a Russia research intern at Timbuktu Institute. And I was basically following the transition from Wagner to Africa Corps in West Africa and how that has been changing the landscape, but not necessarily the people that are actually committing the war crimes. And I saw that your book's publication date was in May, the past May. And I'm curious if you were to publish the book in a few months, how would your book and the contents change because of what happened, the transition this summer?
It would be 200 pages longer and nobody would read it. Yeah, it's probably its own book, I would say. I mean, I have toyed with the idea of kind of the afterlife of this business model. I don't know, it probably would be a podcast, to be honest, just to make sure that people will pay attention to it. I guess the story would be kind of what you probably saw. Same guys, same commanders, same command structure. Really, not that much has changed other than the disappearance of kind of the head honcho and the latent. Although one part of the story, and I'm not sure if you heard this when you were in the field, one thing that we have been hearing is that there's a lot of dissatisfaction amongst the old guys, right, who feel like this new insertion of bureaucracy from the GRU is kind of constraining their capacity, which means they're losing fights in places like Mali, right? And we see, I think they're really, they're about to be handed their hats in Mali, right? Mali is about to fall. If Mali falls, Burkina Faso falls, right? I don't know if it's like boom, boom, boom domino effect, but one chapter in that afterbook would be mostly about the fall of the Sahel. And I would be tracking very closely kind of the internal dynamics. We've even seen Algeria, as you probably also have heard. Algeria, of all places, which is a longtime Russian ally, kind of saying, are you guys doing in our backyard? You know, and kind of pulling away and starting to orient itself toward the United States to buffer the threat that's coming from them to just over the border in Mali. So I think that's the next chapter for sure when it comes to Africa Corps.